Welcome one and all to this Year 10 History lesson, the fight for civil rights beyond Australia's borders. So we're going to be talking about in particular the fight for civil rights in the US, and the fight for civil rights in the US was very influential over the fight for civil rights in Australia. So, our learning goals today. Know when the fight for civil rights began. Know how the fight for civil rights started in the US, which was a big influence over Australia, as mentioned. And I want you to be able to place events on a timeline. We're going to do a little timeline activity for you all. Right on, some international agreements. So let's do a little bit of a timeline here. In the 1940s, most settler nations didn't give rights and freedoms to minorities. So, for example, Britain, it was a settler nation. It went and settled Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada. Now, obviously, there were indigenous people already living there, but the British did not treat them very well, didn't give them equality, didn't give them rights and freedoms. By the 50s, this was beginning to be challenged. And in the 60s, we had the Civil Rights Movement. And just to go back a bit here, in 1948, the United Nations, the UN, made the Declaration of Human Rights, and that was signed by lots of countries, including Australia. So it was a big document saying what human rights everybody should have. So just to give you a brief example, have a look here, and you can see where the British Empire was at its highest point. So all of Canada, half of Africa here, India, Pakistan, Australia, New Zealand. Madness. Britain controlled a lot of area. Here's the UN Declaration of Human Rights on one large piece of paper being held by a nice lady. So, the Montgomery bus boycott. This was a huge event in the civil rights movement in the US. In 1955, a African American woman, Rosa Parks, wouldn't give up her seat for a white person in a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. So in the US at this time, there was segregation, i.e. separation of the races. African Americans had to be at the back of the bus, white people could be at the front. She didn't want to give up her seat. What happened? She got arrested. But it sparked a boycott of the bus company. So this place, Montgomery in Alabama, all the African Americans used to use this bus company. They all boycotted the bus company, and over a year later, so that's how long they had to boycott it for, bus segregation laws were abolished. And Martin Luther King Jr. was a part of that. So here's Rosa Parks not giving up her seat for a white person. I don't know if that's from the time or staged. Anyway. Now, in the US at this time, schools were segregated as well. You had African American schools, and then you had white schools. But that all came to an end during the Civil Rights Movement. So, in 1954, the US Supreme Court said segregation of public schools was against the Constitution. That was Brown v. Board of Education. That was the big court case. But many black students who started going to white schools were racially abused. Yeah. So they opened them up. You should be allowed to just go to the local school. And when an African American student went to go to a white school to start with, they got pretty heavily racially abused. Uncool. And here's one of those famous first African American students who went to a white school. She said, well, there were only 100 bad kids and 1,900 silent witnesses. Okay, so your homework today is to develop your chronology skills. Sorry, not homework, this is just in the middle of the lesson activity. So I want you to put all of these events in the correct order on a timeline from first to last. You're going to need to do a bit of research to find out when they were. So, the Freedom Rides in the US. These were rides that people did to highlight racism in the US. They also had a couple in Australia as well. Brown v. Board of Education, that is the High Court ruling that ended segregation of schools in the US. The March on Washington, big protest, find out when that was, put that on that timeline. The Montgomery bus boycott, which you should just be able to skip back to earlier in this video to find out when that was. The start of the White Australia policy in Australia, I have mentioned when that started. Hint, Federation, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which we said when that was a bit earlier on in this lesson, and the US Civil Rights Act of 1964. I actually didn't put the year in for that one, so that one should be easy for you. Do that. So here is a really awesome website that lays out the timeline for the civil rights movement in Australia and the US. So in yellow you've got the Australian one here, so the original in Australia Day, or also known as Invasion Day, all the way through to all this stuff, Mile Creek Massacre. What we're going to be looking at is here, so the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and then all of these things happened to fight for civil rights in Australia. And then here's the US one. So they happened at around about similar time. I'd say probably the Australian fight for civil rights for Indigenous people was probably 5-10 years behind what was happening in the US. But the US was very influential on Australian fight for civil rights. Here's a video for y'all. That's a short one about the history of the US civil rights movement. Nice.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. The end of the American Civil War in 1865 effectively meant the end of slavery, but African Americans were in for a long struggle before they were finally awarded equal rights. As of 1870, all eligible male citizens were able to vote. However, blacks were discouraged by violence and eventually legal stipulations. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled to maintain racial segregation in private businesses in a case called Plessy v. Ferguson. Soon broadened to include schools, many southern states applied this separate but equal mentality to all aspects of life. However, this led to the application of Jim Crow laws, which resulted in blacks being treated as second-class citizens. Segregated schools, public transit, restrooms, water fountains, and more continued well into the 1900s. In 1909, a group of prominent black and white campaigners created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Their goal was to increase racial equality and challenge issues like the Jim Crow laws. Unfortunately, it was between 1910 and 1930 that white supremacist group the Ku Klux Klan saw its biggest expansion amid increased racial friction. Following the First World War, the NAACP was devoted to ending lynching by white vigilantes. By mid-century, the group became instrumental in the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka court case. This class action suit, filed in 1951, asked that segregation in schools be struck down. Taken to the Supreme Court, the case resulted in the first integrated school in the United States to open in the fall of 1955. Encouraged by the decision, the civil rights movement began to hold high-profile boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and other peaceful protests. These included 1955's Montgomery bus boycott in support of Rosa Parks. A watershed moment came in 1957 when a high school in Arkansas admitted a group of African American students, nicknamed the Little Rock Nine. Protested by fellow students, the governor, and even the state's National Guard, President Dwight Eisenhower eventually intervened to ensure the students' safe passage. By 1962, universities also began integrating, though black students were still met with protests and violence. The Southern Freedom Movement continued into the 60s, with support from newly elected President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The violence of the Birmingham, Alabama campaign influenced the president to fully endorse the movement.
A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
On June 19, 1963, he proposed a civil rights bill to Congress, which was approved in 1964 after his death with support from President Lyndon Johnson. The bill struck down existing legislation that allowed for discrimination, and its approval was largely influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington of August 1963.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
Capturing the attention of the media and the population, this event attracted hundreds of thousands of people in support of civil rights. Following that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended the prejudiced voting system. Instantly effective, blacks began voting and running for public office. However, just days later, on August 11th, a violent six-day riot in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts resulted in 34 deaths. This was indicative of a period of racially motivated violence that occurred in the mid to late 1960s. This era also saw the rise of Black Power, led in large part by Stokely Carmichael, in opposition to extremists like the Ku Klux Klan. This ideology was exemplified by the Black Panther Party, which followed the principles set forth by Malcolm X. Rising to prominence in the 1950s, his radical ideas advocated militancy for blacks.
Black people are dissatisfied. They're dissatisfied not only with the white man, but they're dissatisfied with these Negroes who have been sitting around here posing as leaders and spokesmen for black people and actually making the problem worse instead of making the problem better.
He remained an influential and controversial human rights activist until his assassination in 1965. The murders of civil rights leaders continued when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in April 1968 and Robert Kennedy 2 months later. Despite racial tensions continuing into the 1990s, progress has been measurable. The election of President Barack Obama in 2008 is seen by many to be a culmination of centuries of work in favor of racial equality.
This is the meaning of our liberty and our creed, why men and women and children of every race and every faith can join in celebration across this magnificent mall, and why a man whose father less than 60 years ago might not have been served at a local restaurant can now stand before you to take a most sacred oath.
Okay, your reflection activity for today. I want you to complete a 3-2-1 on the topic of civil rights. So what's 3-2-1? A 3-2-1 is 3. You come up with 3 things that you learned from the lesson, 2 things that you found interesting and would like to learn more about, and 1 thing that you still have questions about. That is your reflection activity for today. Right, the moment of fun. Homework. I want you to answer these questions. Now remember to include the question in your answer. Don't just write the answer, because when you read that later it won't mean anything, okay? So, why was Rosa Parks arrested? And your answer is going to be, Rosa Parks was arrested because... whatever. Question 2, what were the effects of this? The effects of Rosa Parks being arrested were... blah blah blah. And question 3, how significant was her arrest? And why? So however significant you think it was, I want you to back up why you think it was that significant. We mentioned significance here, so they're your homework questions, because there are these things called historical thinking skills. Here they are. Historical significance, cause and consequence, perspective, primary sources, the ethical dimension, and continuity and change. They are the 3 historical thinking skills that lie behind the curriculum. So we're trying to develop your skill in figuring out historical significance with that homework task. Fun. Bonus homework. Read chapter 4.5 from the Jacaranda textbook if you want. And check out this video. This is a crash course. Great series, but the guy talks quite quickly. It's a crash course US history about the civil rights movement. Thank you very much. Keep it real. Bye.